Folks, Russ Scala here. Today we've got an amazing guest, Keith Bell. He's from thegutclub.org, and we're going to talk about how the intestinal tract is a second brain and how all health resonates and starts in the intestinal tract. We're going to talk about diet and how medication can compromise the beneficial flora in your gut. Keith.
Good to see you, Russ.
Do your thing, my man.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, you know, we're talking about medication and how that can compromise flora. That's an interesting subject. You know, let's talk about metformin to begin with. It's the leading diabetes medication. And how does it work? How do you think metformin is actually working?
I know it affects the flora, but it also drops the blood sugar correctly on a cellular level?
Yeah, and it's also associated with vitamin B12 deficiency.
Right.
But it's also known to create longevity. There's one paper I found, a research paper, that was showing that metformin can actually make worms live longer. They did a worm study, and it was found that the mechanism was through the microbiota.
So metformin, a lot of my clients and patients and a few other podcasts that I do, they really preach metformin because it keeps, you know, inflammation and the insulin levels down, which we know those are the two things that accelerates the aging process and oxidative stress. So the perfect storm for aging and damaging us on a cellular level is elevated blood glucose, right? Insulin and inflammation, and the metformin seems to put the brakes on that, at least everything that I've been reading.
You know, there's a lot of benefit. I agree that metformin has.
I think berberine too. Isn't berberine one of them?
Well, berberine is a more natural substance.
I got you.
Yeah, and that's also, in my view, working through the microbiota.
I got you. Okay.
In fact, I like to see everything through a microbial lens.
No, I got you.
You can look at you know, even the statin drugs working through the microbiota because and any food we eat as well. It's not a simple matter of just putting nutrients in our bodies. It's first has to be processed by our microbes, and then the microbes produce substances that drive our immune system.
I had this 80-year-old guy that's a golfer, and this sort of broke my heart, and you'll get this. The guy golfs about 4 times a week, and he's retired. A good man. He goes to his doctor, his general practitioner, and his cholesterol is a little elevated. So the doctor puts him on a statin, and then he puts him on a proton pump inhibitor because the guy has heartburn. Now, of course, he's had this doctor for 30 years, and I'm not going to tell this guy the doctor's doing everything wrong, but I watched this guy over a period of like 4 months. The statin drug started to affect his memory. It started to affect him playing golf because his inflammation markers went up. The statin drug was damaging him on a cellular level, and I'm watching this in real time. And then the proton pump inhibitor allowed food to get into his intestinal tract undigested. He wasn't pulling nutrients out of food. This 80-year-old guy started mining nutrients out of his own tissue, and then he stopped golfing, he stopped socializing, all because he followed the doctor's advice. And when he went in and complained to the doctor about his symptoms, he put him on an antidepressant. I'm like, holy mackerel. And again, I don't want to sound like, you know, a Jehovah's, you know, I don't want to sound like the guy that's always coming through the door like a conspiracy theorist, but I watched this guy's quality of life just go in the toilet, and it never had to.
Well, the fact is that the pharmaceutical drugs have been found to be the 3rd leading cause of death. So, you know, this is taking care of symptoms and not the cause.
Understood.
You know, so, you know, you talk about statin drugs, they're known to cause CoQ10 deficiency.
Exactly.
And I see this as, you know, through the microbial lens again, because the microbes are using the same pathway that we use to lower cholesterol. They use that same pathway to manufacture CoQ10.
Gotcha.
And so then what is created is a deficiency of CoQ10 because we're working along with our microbes. We're sharing the pool of CoQ10 in our bodies with microbiota. They use it, they make it and break it. And that's something protective on the cellular level. And when that's missing, that's when you create cognitive problems.
Exactly. Folks, I don't want you to be ever afraid to ask your doctor questions. So many of us think the doctors have all the answers. They're not trained in nutrition. You know, they're not trained in interventional endocrinology. They're definitely not trained in your gut. I've worked with hundreds of patients that in their 70s and 80s, they spend half the week going to doctors, and I know that quality of life sucks. So I want you to ask the questions. When you go into get educated, ask your doctor about the drug, ask the doctor about the side effects, ask the doctor about testing your microbiome. Take control of your health, folks. It's up to you. Take control of your health. Don't just put it in somebody else's hands.
That's for sure. We have to be the greatest self-advocates these days. And we need to find ways to take care of ourselves. And probably the most important thing is diet. There's no substitute for a good diet. And oftentimes, it can be something as simple as lowering carbohydrate intake.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, ever since you and I started having dialogue, I think you're brilliant. I've read some of your papers. I'm like, oh my God. And it started out with your dog, which I think is so cool. We got to drip the science on people slowly. Mm-hmm. Because, for years, people were told by their doctors, their personal trainers, their dietitians, they've been given misinformation. So mm-hmm. again, without you and I sounding like conspiracy theorists, or I don't want people to see us, I want to educate them to say, this is, what I'm always trying to do is transfer learning to behavior, teach people basic biology so it'll resonate in their head. Mm-hmm. So if they go to the Russ Scala YouTube channel, they could maybe watch something on carbohydrates, maybe watch something about the microbiome, and then when they go to bed that night, some of the mm-hmm. they'll link up some some ideas and start thinking about somebody in their family with dementia, for instance.
Right. Well, even the progressive people are starting now to catch on. Like the ketogenic community.
Huge.
And the paleo community.
Yeah, I love those guys.
All the low carbohydrate diets out there, people are starting to realize that the mechanism is not so simple. It's not just about lowering carbohydrates and raising fat and magically our bodies change and our metabolism is improved. But more and more, these communities are starting to realize that it's about flora shift.
Right, exactly.
So when we're lowering carbohydrates, we're doing things like lowering Clostridium levels and raising levels of more protective bacteria.
Yeah, I answer questions at night to a couple of groups. Dan Quibell, the bacon experiment, where he puts you on bacon for 30 days. This guy's mm-hmm. really passionate mm-hmm. about getting people answers. There's some other keto groups that are sort of snobby because they talk high level. Mm-hmm. I think when people sort of stumble onto a ketogenic group, they're going to need coaching. Mm-hmm. And the coach has got to understand that these people are, you're dropped into the second act of a third act play. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people that stall, that say, I'm not losing weight on low carb, what do I do? It's the flora.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the ketogenic community is just now, I'm trying to drip a little science on them, but yes. Some of them get offended because they think I'm trying to take their clients away from them. Well, but I'm not. I'm open sourcing this stuff like you're doing, like you and I are doing right now.
Right, it's a matter of sharing information.
Exactly.
We can read all the research papers we want, but I think, as you pointed out earlier, even a greater impact can be made through informal discussions like this and informal articles in magazines. People learn more from that than they do a research paper.
I like people to form communities. And that's one of the things I want to stress, folks. Form a little community of like-minded people in your neighborhood mm-hmm. and discuss this stuff. Maybe, discuss the gut-brain connection. Get people thinking, because every person, they did studies on weddings and funerals, and every person has about 120 connections. If you form a little community in your neighborhood, or you got kids, or the kids are eating certain foods, or maybe somebody's trying to lose some weight, you talk about the gut-brain connection and neurotransmitter levels and explain what Keith and you're going to create a viral market of knowledge in your own neighborhood.
Yeah. One neighborhood, so-called neighborhood and community would be the type 1 diabetes community.
Huge.
They found that low-carb diets are effective in attenuating the symptoms of type 1 diabetes. Now, what's the mechanism? I like to think it's flora shift. And then we have issues with Alzheimer's. That's now called type 3 diabetes.
Exactly.
And insulin resistance in the brain. So, there are people out there that believe we can prevent diabetes by cutting down on our sugar and carbohydrate intake. So I think it's a very powerful tool that we need to, right now I'm reversing metabolic syndrome in myself. I'm 56 years old. I've probably consumed in my, childhood enough breakfast cereal to sink a Navy ship. Hopefully I've caught on, in time to add years to my life just by simply lowering carbohydrate intake.
Yeah, and I tell people, you know, I love everything you're saying, and I tell people go slow with the carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
You know, lower them slowly because, you know, they affect the neurotransmitter serotonin. These are all neurotransmitters that affect our mood.
Yes.
If you cut the carbs out of the diet too quick,
Yes.
you may get cranky. You may go through some withdrawals. There are people that are addicted to carbohydrates. So my point is, you know, on some of these keto groups, they go, oh, I had a cheat day. And everybody goes, you can't cheat, you can't cheat. And I'm like, listen, let's take a page out of the book called Potatoes Not Prozac. High stress people, I deal with the outliers, cops, firemen, war veterans. If they have a day where they got to eat carbohydrates, go for it. Folks, I want you to think about what's on your plate, your diet, how it affects the gut-brain connection. We all know everybody is biochemically unique. We know the ketogenic diet is a hot topic. We all know that the psychiatric community is treating the head and not the microbiome. So now we're going to talk about, with Keith, how your diet affects your brain chemistry and your intestinal flora.
Well, that's a huge topic because there's nothing more important than diet. Diet, you know, can trump your genes 7 days a week. You know, there are papers that show that diet actually is more important than our genetics.
It could turn on and off genes.
Sure, and you know, we have the nutrigenomics community.
Right.
They've always focused on how diet can change our genes, but what they're missing is the middle man, you know, or the middle gut. You know, the bacteria are actually running the show. Okay, and it's not just our bacteria, but our microbiome is a huge community of bacteria and viruses, including the phage community that keep our bacteria in check, protozoans, fungi, and all of this community together is utilizing food that we place into our mouths. So we need to eat for two, so to speak. We're eating for our you know, ourselves and for our microbes.
I think a learning point here is that years ago, when disease and bacteria like polio and typhoid were killing people, they wanted to eradicate bacteria in the world, all over the world. Mm-hmm. Millions of people were dying. So in our mind, we thought that bacteria was bad. Now, right. when diseases were killing us in the early 1900s, mm-hmm. now we've got non-diseases killing us, like diabetes and heart disease and cancer, mm-hmm. and people still have that mindset that bacteria is bad, and it's not. Like mm-hmm. women that are always worried about their kids getting dirty, we know that dirt, and we know that when a baby's delivered vaginally, the microbiome is enhanced. I think that's going to be a tool to help educate people. Don't we have more bacterial cells and protozoas than we have normal cells in our body?
Yeah, you know, there's some debate about that. I mean, it used to be said there were 10 times more microbial cells, than human cells.
Gotcha.
But there's some debate these days. But what's really important is the interaction among the different kinds of microbes. For instance, you brought up polio. Here's a very interesting fact, that viral replication is actually based on the types of bacteria that the viruses are interacting with, because they're attracted to sugar, but not just any sugar. It's the sugar in the cell wall of bacteria. There's one study that showed that poliovirus infectivity was raised 500% based on interaction with a certain type of bacteria, because they're going after those bacteria and the sugar in the cell wall and using that to replicate.
Interesting. That's all, it's all interconnected with the gut. That's fascinating. Folks, if you get any takeaways from this, just remember that all disease is multifactorial, and we've got to incorporate the intestinal tract testing in order to get ourselves healthy. Whether it's addiction or sports performance or diabetes, we've got to look at the intestinal flora. Would that be safe to say?
Definitely. And we can talk all day about how diet shifts flora and how this awareness is really growing in the ketogenic community, the type 1 diabetes community. People are starting to understand that it's not just a magical transformation based on diet, but it's how the diet affects the microbial populations and how it can balance flora. And it's that kind of homeostasis that we're after when we talk about diet. And something as simple as lowering carbohydrate intake and lowering sugar, especially sugar.
Yeah, I always tell people to go slow, because I work with the outliers, war veterans, cops. firemen, endurance athletes that get post-race depression. The carbohydrates help elevate serotonin levels.
Yes.
So,
well,
I don't want them to cut them out too quick because they won't be compliant. You know what I'm saying?
That's a good point. So we don't want to completely eliminate carbohydrates because it's those carbs that allow the precursor to serotonin to cross the blood-brain barrier, and that's tryptophan.
There you go.
And tryptophan metabolism is a deep subject because tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin, which is the precursor to melatonin, but also tryptophan is the precursor to niacin, and niacin is a very important mineral. I'm sorry, vitamin in our bodies, vitamin B3. So that all relates to gut-brain health. But that tryptophan metabolism is so important because microbes can raise tryptophan levels in the body, especially bifidobacteria, but also other types of microbes are consuming tryptophan. So our microbes are making and breaking tryptophan, and this tryptophan metabolism is really starting to be a focus in the medical literature.
I had talk about this. I had a professional tennis player drinking Chimbuca tea, taking a bunch of bifidobacteria. And when I did the gut testing, they had a lot of imbalances. So what does that tell people? Should they just swallow probiotics, or should they wait and get tested? I mean, what's the best course of action, you think?
Well, I think probiotics are essential, for almost any condition. And the way I like to think of it is the small intestine is the center of all health.
Okay.
And that's where we need our lactic acid bacteria. Most of the probiotics on the shelf are lactic acid bacteria, bifidobacteria and lactobacillus.
Okay.
But most of the strains are transient helpers. They help with carbohydrate metabolism.
Right.
But there are some strains that are proven to colonize. So they can actually help, to lead toward, a better state that would be long-term help to create balance in our microbial populations.
A lot of people in the ketogenic diet community, I like watching what they're doing, and when they stall, when they stop losing weight, I always wonder, because fat distribution is genetically determined, hormonally regulated. So upper and lower body fat in women, estrogen, testosterone, DHEA. I know the hormonal component is not talked about a lot in the ketogenic community. Also, I was thinking about if these people stall, is it because of their gut bacteria? Is it a multifactorial thing we got to look at? Is the gut testing another tool for the ketogenic community to use? Because I've talked about it before, but I don't get any traction. Not that I'm worried about that. I'm just trying to educate people.
I'm pretty sure it is the reason, because the ketogenic diet or any very low carb diet might be considered therapeutic for a month, but after that you might run the risk of starving your beneficial lactic acid bacteria that protect your small intestine. And as I mentioned, I think that's the center of all health, because it's providing blood flow to the liver, so it affects your liver health. It's affecting your pancreas. That small intestine is right between your liver and your pancreas.
Gotcha.
So, if you go on a very low carb diet long term and you're not feeding the right kinds of fiber and the right kinds of sugars to bifidobacteria and lactobacillus, then you might be, continuing to raise other strains of bacteria like proteobacteria and Klebsiella, which can take over the territory of the small intestine.
That's a great point. Again, certain things to be aware of. We are all biochemically unique. People that don't respond to the ketogenic diet or people that stall need to add more tools to their toolbox.
Exactly, and a lot of people, are afraid of taking a probiotic. But I think even more powerful than a probiotic are what are called prebiotics. And they may want to experiment with certain prebiotics. There are some on the shelves, and food is a prebiotic. So that's where diet comes in.
Like the sauerkraut and the fermented foods.
Well, those might be considered more probiotics.
Probiotics, okay.
Yes, but the prebiotic foods are the safe starches.
Okay.
Things with high inulin content.
Inulin, yeah.
Yeah, now that's really important because those things are what are feeding the microbes that are communicating with the cells of the gut, of the lining of the intestines, which is where about 70 to 80% of our immune system resides.
Right, exactly.
And they're helping to signal our cells, what are called goblet cells in the gut, that are secreting mucins. That's the mucus layer that protects our intestinal lining from microbes. We need that healthy mucus layer in our gut. There are a couple brand new papers as of this week that show how important that mucus layer is. And so that speaks toward the idea that we need to eat fiber, because if we don't eat fiber, our microbes have access to the intestinal cells, the epithelial cells, and instead of dining on that mucus layer, they eat us.
I got you.
You know, so we run the risk of ulceration, and that means that they also wreak havoc with the nerve fibers and bundles that are in the lining of the gut, and that's a direct connection to the brain. That's a really important gut-brain connection because we have, the vagus nerve connecting the gut and the brain.
Yeah, here's a vagus nerve right here.
Yeah.
That's not a great graphic, but I my people did their best.
Yes. Well, it's a beautiful graphic. I love the chart because it's talking also about the neurotransmitters, and the precursors of those are amino acids, and those levels of amino acids are regulated by gut microbes.
Exactly. One of the things we see in traumatic brain injuries and TBI, and I've worked on a lot of traumatic brain injuries as part of a team. We know when the intestinal tract is in balance the correct way, and we notice when we increase certain hormonal levels, we can increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is the miracle grow for the brain, and then vascular endothelial growth factor are the veins and arteries to support that new brain tissue. So that in combination with beneficial flora, we can help stroke patients rehab themselves. It's pretty fascinating.
Yes. Another really important and growing awareness in the gut-brain connection is the lymphatic system.
There we go.
And that begins in the gut.
Right.
In fact, that's all part of the same territory we're talking about, where the nerve bundles and fibers are. There are the lacteals of the gut that are part of the nutrient absorption. And we'll talk about that as it relates to things like childhood growth. But what's happening is there are what are called Peyer's patches, and those have to interact with the right kinds of microbial populations, and that's the beginning of the lymphatic system, because what happens right there is where microbes and products of microbes enter the lymphatic system and go into systemic circulation, and that is most likely a direct connection to the brain, because it's been recently discovered that the brain has a lymphatic system known as the glymphatics.
Wow.
So, we need to keep our lymphatic system healthy because there is, get this, Russ, 3 to 5 times more lymphatic fluid in the body than blood.
All right, there we go. Yeah, that's a great analogy. I always tell people, listen, when people go into their doctors and they're not getting answers, they go on the internet, I always tell them, think about this. Keep a food mood log. Track yourself. You're an experiment of one. There's 8,000 foods out there. We only have tendency to eat 11. Like you said, Keith, your body could resonate by just shifting the carbs out of the diet. Your body may resonate if you're pulling nutrients out of food more efficiently. Just for argument's sake, let's just say, and I know there's a lot of studies out there, you need about 21 minerals, 13 vitamins, 8 amino acids, 2 essential fats, and a little bit of starch and sunlight. If you do not get that from food and your body is not absorbing it in your gut, you're going to mine it from your own tissue. So sarcopenia or muscle wasting is a huge problem with the elderly, people over 50. What's in my mind is I used to take people into nursing homes when I was a paramedic, and then fast forward 20 years, I worked in hormone replacement centers where we were protecting people from sarcopenia with growth hormone and testosterone and getting them thyroid and amping up their normal HPA axis. And I watched people in their 70s and 80s still riding their bikes in Europe, still hanging out, still laughing, and that always stayed with me. And we knew the importance of the gut back then, because here's what happens. Growth hormone is real important testosterone is real important both for men and women. But people with Crohn's disease and irritable bowel, they have very low growth hormone because their intestinal tract isn't working properly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And hormones are all coming from cholesterol.
Exactly.
And people are so worried about their cholesterol levels when, and trying to lower them with pharmaceutical drugs like statins, and they may be doing themselves harm because cholesterol is really our friend, and people are starting to learn that.
Yeah, I told everybody, that it's funny because the ketogenic community, people have answers like, my doctor says my cholesterol's through the roof. And I try to explain to people that cholesterol surrounds every lipid bilayer and every cell in your body. It makes up your brain. It's such an important ingredient, but because it got vilified, because they said cholesterol was bad in the 1950s, I think Russ Scala Keith came out with that, everybody drank the Kool-Aid. And I don't like using the word sheeples. Everybody says, oh, look at the sheeples doing this. Listen, people have been misinformed, lied to. Take a line out of Malcolm X, hoodwinked, lied to, and bamboozled. I mean, so how could you call somebody a sheeple when they're overweight, they're not sleeping, they go to their doctor, their personal trainer, and their nutritionist all tell them to eat low fat. They don't know where to turn. So now we're teaching them that fat is important. Fat makes up your brain chemistry. And I think that's why what I like that we're doing is we're educating the people. We're educating you folks slowly. I don't want to overwhelm anybody, but we want to drip science on you slowly with Keith and my research so you can start making smart decisions about what's on your plate there and relieve some of those symptoms, which is arbitrarily swallowing a bunch of drugs and becoming the walking wounded.
Yeah, it's a good point. Another really big topic, you brought up sunlight. And that speaks toward vitamin D deficiency, which is pandemic. Maybe the biggest bang for the buck in terms of a supplement would be taking vitamin D3 to balance your microbes in your small intestine.
Wow.
That's really the mechanism that, as I view vitamin D. And people think it's about sunshine. Well, vitamin D deficiency is such a problem all over the world that it's obviously not a matter of not getting into the sun. But what the science is showing, as far back as 2010, is that microbes are playing a role in the absorption of vitamin D in the small intestine.
Exactly.
And they're actually messing with the VDRs, the vitamin D receptors.
Yeah, and again, this gets back to, folks, this gets back to treating systems instead of just treating things in isolation. What Keith and I are trying to get across to you is that you can make your body resonate by cleaning up your intestinal tract, by getting it tested. The average American today has to go to his general practitioner, his cardiologist, his diabetic doctor, his psychiatrist. He goes on a journey. What we want to do, instead of treating systems in isolation, we want to treat a system, starting out with your intestinal tract. Is that fair to say?
Sure. As has been said, all death begins in the colon.
Yeah. Who said that?
Hippocrates.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. I thought I read that somewhere.
Yeah.
that goes back a ways. Okay, folks, I want you to check out the Russ Scala YouTube channel, Scala Precision Health, Keith Bell's website, thegutclub.org, and think about getting tested, okay?
Great. It's good to speak with you today about diet because that's where it's at. Diet shifts flora. We need to think about eating not just for ourselves, but for our microbes.
Cool.